the heart he never meant to steal. She never expected the man who came to destroy her dreams would end up teaching her how to truly live them. Picture this: it's 2 in the morning, and Dahlia Brooks stands in her grandmother's kitchen, tears mixing with flour as she kneads croissant dough with trembling hands. Tomorrow, the town council votes on whether to let a corporate giant demolish everything she's ever loved. Her bakery. Her community. Her heart. But 6 months ago, when that polished stranger first walked through her door with his expensive suit and cold blue eyes, she had no idea that the man sent to destroy her world would become the one person who could save it. She couldn't have known that beneath his corporate armor beat the heart of a 12-year-old boy who'd lost everything on this very same land. And she certainly never imagined that fighting him would teach her how to fight for herself, or that loving him would transform them both in ways that would heal wounds neither knew they carried. The scent of vanilla and cinnamon fills the air as steam rises from her ovens, but all she can taste are the tears of uncertainty. Because sometimes, the person who challenges everything you believe about yourself turns out to be exactly who you need to become whole. Sometimes, the enemy becomes the answer you never knew you were seeking. Have you ever met someone who challenged everything you believed about yourself, and discovered they were exactly who you needed to become whole? Someone who walked into your life as an adversary but awakened parts of your soul you didn't even know existed? If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our Dear Love Diaries family. Your special place in this community of heartfelt stories is waiting for you. These passionate journeys of souls connecting against all odds have brought together thousands of beautiful hearts just like yours. Make sure you hit the bell too, so you'll know immediately when a new story unfolds in our Diary of Love. Hello once again, my beautiful Love Diaries family. Welcome back to our sacred space, where hearts gather from around the world to share in stories that remind us love conquers all. Whether you're curled up with your morning coffee or winding down after a long day, you found your way back to the place where souls connect through the power of storytelling. I'm so grateful for each of you who make this community what it is. Your comments, your stories, your open hearts, they fuel every tale I share. When you tell me how these stories have touched your lives, how they've given you hope or helped you see love in a new light, you remind me why we gather here week after week. This story is special, dear ones. It's about the kind of love that blooms in the most unexpected soil, between two people who think they're enemies but discover they're actually two halves of the same wounded heart seeking healing. It's about a woman who thought she was fighting for her bakery but was really fighting for her right to dream, and a man who thought he was building an empire but was really running from the boy who'd lost everything. I'm curious, where in this beautiful world are you watching from today? Whether you're in a bustling city or a quiet village, whether you're surrounded by the scent of your own baking or the sounds of morning traffic, drop your location in the comments below. Your presence makes this story more powerful, and I love knowing how far our love stories travel. So settle in, my dear family. Let your heart open to a story about second chances, about the courage to be vulnerable, and about how authentic love can transform not just two people, but an entire community. The sun hadn't yet painted the sky pink over Magnolia Creek when Dahlia Brooks pushed through the back door of Brooks Bakery, her grandmother's apron already tied around her waist. The familiar weight of it, soft cotton worn smooth by decades of loving hands, grounded her the way morning prayers grounded others. This was her sanctuary, her inheritance, her everything. The scent of yesterday's bread still lingered in the air, mixing with the promise of today's creations. Dahlia breathed it in deeply, the way some people breathed in ocean air or mountain pine. This was her essence, her identity wrapped up in flour and butter and the alchemy of turning simple ingredients into moments of joy. Her hands moved with practiced grace, measuring and mixing the brioche dough that would become the day's first batch. Ruby Mae Washington had taught her that baking was meditation, that every fold of the dough was a prayer, every rise a small miracle. And Lord knew she needed miracles these days. The numbers on last month's bill sat heavy in her mind like stones in her apron pocket. The new ovens she'd invested in last year, the renovations to make the bakery more accessible, the community events she'd hosted to keep downtown Magnolia Creek alive, all of it had been investments in love, in hope, in the belief that some things were worth more than profit margins. But hope didn't pay electricity bills. Love couldn't cover the mortgage payments that seemed to grow heavier each month. "You're here early, even for you." Tommy Lee's voice carried the warmth of steam from the coffee shop next door as he poked his head through the connecting doorway they'd opened between their businesses years ago. His dark eyes held the kind of concern that came from friendship deep as roots. "Couldn't sleep," Dahlia admitted, not looking up from her work. "Big day today." Tommy stepped fully into her kitchen, bringing with him the scent of fresh ground coffee beans. He'd been her anchor through every storm, the friend who showed up without being asked, who believed in her dreams even when she forgot how to believe in them herself. "The town council meeting isn't until 7 tonight," he said gently. "You've got 12 hours to stress yourself into the ground." Dahlia's laugh came out shorter than she intended. "Or 12 hours to create enough beautiful things to remind everyone what we're fighting for." She gestured toward the cooling racks already filling with golden croissants, the mixing bowls lined up like soldiers preparing for battle. By opening time, this kitchen would have produced enough comfort food to feed an army, or a town full of people who needed reminding that some things were worth preserving. The bell above the front door chimed, its cheerful brass voice echoing through the empty bakery. Dahlia frowned. They didn't open for another hour, but she never locked the door against neighbors who might need an early morning treat or a listening ear. "I'll handle it," Tommy offered, but Dahlia was already wiping her hands on her apron, already moving toward the front counter with the grace of someone who'd been caring for people through food since she could reach the mixing bowls. The man standing in her bakery looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine spread about successful city living. His charcoal suit was tailored to perfection, his shoes polished to a mirror shine that seemed almost aggressive in the warm, flour-dusted space of her kitchen. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold, ice blue and calculating, sweeping over her domain like an appraiser taking inventory. "We're not open yet," Dahlia said, her voice carrying the particular strength that came from defending sacred ground. "But if you need coffee or a pastry, I can." "Ms. Brooks." His voice was smooth as expensive whiskey, with an authority that expected to be obeyed. "I'm Sebastian Vale from Vale Development Group. I believe you received our correspondence regarding the acquisition of this property." The words hit her like cold water, washing away the morning's peaceful rhythm and replacing it with the sharp edge of battle readiness. This was him. The corporate shark who'd been circling her community for months, the man behind the sterile letters and aggressive offers that had been showing up in mailboxes throughout downtown Magnolia Creek. But somehow, she hadn't expected him to be so present. So undeniably male. So completely out of place in her world yet impossible to ignore. "Mr. Vale." She straightened to her full height, chin lifting in the gesture her grandmother had called Brooks' backbone showing. "I believe I've made my position quite clear in my responses to your correspondence." His smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Positions can change when circumstances become clearer." "And what circumstances would those be?" Sebastian Vale moved through her bakery like he owned it, his gaze cataloging every detail with the cold efficiency of a predator. When he reached the display case, he paused, and for just a moment, something flickered across his features. Something that looked almost like recognition, like memory. But then it was gone, replaced by that corporate mask of polite indifference. "The reality of business, Ms. Brooks. This entire block is being acquired for a development project that will bring jobs, revenue, and growth to Magnolia Creek. Progress has a way of moving forward whether we're ready or not." Progress. Dahlia tasted the word like something bitter. "Is that what you call erasing a century of history? Destroying the places where people have built their lives, their memories, their community?" She gestured around the bakery, where photographs of 5 generations of Magnolia Creek residents lined the walls. Wedding cakes and birthday celebrations, first dates and business meetings, funeral receptions and baby showers, all of life's moments had been witnessed and sweetened within these walls. "I call it economics," Sebastian replied, but something in his voice had shifted, lost some of its earlier edge. "Sentiment doesn't pay the bills, Ms. Brooks. And from what I understand, your bills are becoming quite pressing." The words should have felt like a slap, but instead they felt like exposure, like having her deepest fears spoken aloud by a stranger who had no right to know them. How did he know about her financial struggles? How much digging had this man done into her life? "My business affairs are none of your concern," she said, but even she could hear how the strength had leaked out of her voice. "They became my concern when they started affecting the timeline of our project." Sebastian reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder thick with documents. "I'm prepared to make you an offer that's significantly more generous than our previous proposals. Enough to clear your debts and set you up comfortably wherever you choose to relocate." He set the folder on her counter, right next to the display of morning pastries that were cooling on racks. The juxtaposition felt obscene, all that money and legal language sitting beside the croissants she'd shaped with her own hands before dawn. "I don't want your money," Dahlia said, but her eyes betrayed her, flickering toward the folder despite herself. "Everyone wants money, Ms. Brooks. The question is whether they want it enough to be practical about how they get it." Practical. The word came out like a curse. "You mean whether I want it enough to betray everything my family built, everything this community depends on?" Sebastian's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. "I mean whether you want it enough to face reality. This development is happening, with or without your cooperation. You can be part of the solution and profit from it, or you can be part of the problem and lose everything when the project moves forward anyway. And if I refuse? Then you'll discover exactly how quickly a business can fail when it's fighting forces larger than itself." The threat hung in the air between them like smoke from a grease fire. But as Dahlia stared at this man who'd invaded her sanctuary with his ultimatums and his cruel mathematics, something unexpected happened. She noticed the way his fingers drummed against his thigh, a nervous habit that contradicted his controlled exterior. She saw how his eyes lingered on the photograph behind the counter, her grandmother's picture from the bakery's 50th anniversary celebration. And when the morning sun shifted through the windows, catching the scent of rising bread and cinnamon rolls, she watched something flicker across his face that looked almost like hunger. Not for food, but for something deeper. Something that had been missing from his life for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to want it. "You know what I think, Mr. Vale?" Dahlia moved around the counter, closing the distance between them until she could see the flecks of silver in his blue eyes, until she could smell the expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask something warmer underneath. "I think you've forgotten what it feels like to be part of something that matters more than profit margins." She reached for one of the warm croissants, golden and perfect, and held it out to him. "When's the last time someone baked something just for you? When's the last time you tasted love in your food instead of just calories and convenience?" Sebastian stared at the pastry like it might bite him. "Ms. Brooks, I'm not here for breakfast." "No, you're here to destroy breakfast. To tear down the place where children learn that someone cares enough to make their birthday cake special, where couples share their first date over coffee and homemade pie, where people gather when they're celebrating and when they're grieving because food is love made tangible." She was standing close enough now to see the way his jaw clenched, close enough to notice that his hands weren't quite steady as he reached for the croissant. When their fingers brushed in the transfer, she felt an electric shock that had nothing to do with static and everything to do with the way his touch seemed to burn through her skin. Sebastian lifted the pastry to his lips, and for a moment, his corporate mask slipped entirely. His eyes closed as he tasted her work, and the expression that crossed his face was so naked, so vulnerable, that Dahlia felt like she was witnessing something private and profound. "Good," he said quietly, and his voice had lost all its earlier aggression. "My grandmother's recipe," Dahlia whispered, unable to look away from the transformation happening in front of her. "She used to say that every croissant carries the baker's heart. That when you eat something made with love, you're tasting a piece of someone's soul." Sebastian's eyes opened, and when they met hers, she saw something there that stole her breath. Pain, deep and old and carefully hidden. longing for something he couldn't name. And underneath it all, a flicker of recognition, as if her croissant had awakened a memory he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten it existed. But then the moment shattered like dropped glass. "Sentiment and metaphors don't change business realities," Sebastian said, his voice returned to its earlier coldness. But his hands, Dahlia noticed, were trembling slightly as he set the half-eaten croissant down on her counter. "Perhaps not," she replied, matching his formal tone even though her heart was racing from whatever had just passed between them. "But they change people. And people change business realities." Sebastian gathered his folder, his movements sharp and efficient, but Dahlia caught the way his eyes lingered on the croissant he'd abandoned, the way he seemed reluctant to leave despite his words. "You have until Friday to consider our offer, Ms. Brooks. After that, the timeline becomes less flexible." He was almost to the door when Dahlia called after him. "Mr. Vale?" He paused, his hand on the brass handle that had welcomed thousands of customers over the decades. "That croissant recipe has been in my family for 4 generations. It survived the Depression, 2 wars, and countless changes to this town. Some things are stronger than they appear. Some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds seem impossible." Sebastian turned back to look at her, and for just a heartbeat, she saw the boy he'd once been lurking behind those ice-blue eyes. Scared, hurt, fighting for survival in a world that had taken everything from him. "And some fights," he said quietly, "cost more than losing ever could." He left her standing in the golden morning light, surrounded by the scent of bread and the weight of impossible choices. But as Dahlia watched his expensive car pull away from the curb, she realized something that should have frightened her but instead filled her with a strange, fierce hope. Sebastian Vale wasn't nearly as cold as he pretended to be. And that crack she'd seen in his armor, that moment when he'd tasted her croissant and remembered what it felt like to be fed with love, meant this war was far from over. "I'd love to know, what's the most important place in your community? The one spot that holds everyone's memories and dreams? Share it in the comments below, because every community has that special place that deserves to be protected." Chapter 2. The rest of that Tuesday passed in a blur of concerned neighbors and emergency planning sessions. Word traveled fast in Magnolia Creek, faster than gossip, faster than bad weather, and certainly faster than the hope Dahlia was trying to maintain. By noon, her bakery had become unofficial campaign headquarters for the resistance. Ruby Mae Washington held court at the corner table, her weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup while she dispensed wisdom and strategy in equal measure. Honey Williams paced between the tables, her town council member badge catching the light as she outlined the political realities they were facing. 3 council members are already committed to the development, Honey was saying, her voice tight with frustration. Morrison's people have been making promises, jobs, tax revenue, modernization. People are scared about the future, Dahlia. Scared enough to believe that progress means tearing down the past. Tommy Lee leaned against the counter, his coffee shop having effectively merged with the bakery for the duration of the crisis. "What about the historical preservation angle? This building's been here since 1924. "Not old enough," Honey replied. "Needs to be pre-1900 for automatic protection, and even then, there are ways around it if the economic benefits are significant enough." Dahlia kneaded tomorrow's bread dough with more force than necessary, her hands working out the frustration and fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Every punch and fold of the dough was a prayer, a plea, a promise that she wouldn't go down without a fight. "There has to be something," she said, her voice muffled by the exertion of working the stubborn dough. "Some way to make them understand what they'd be destroying." Ruby Mae's voice carried the weight of 8 decades when she spoke. "Child, some people don't understand the value of roots until they've been torn up and blown away. But that man who came in here this morning? He's got roots here whether he remembers them or not." Dahlia's hands stilled in the dough. "What do you mean?" "Sebastian Vale." Ruby Mae's eyes held the sharpness of someone who'd watched this town grow and change for most of her life. "I knew his grandmother, Evelyn Vale. Sweet woman, used to bring her grandson here for cookies every Saturday morning when he was just a little thing. Hair white as flour even then, eyes blue as December sky. The room went quiet except for the gentle hum of the ovens. Dahlia felt something shift in her chest, a puzzle piece clicking into place. His grandmother brought him here? Every Saturday for years, until the family lost their farm and moved away. That boy couldn't have been more than 12 when they left. Broke Evelyn's heart, losing that land. It had been in their family for generations. Tommy straightened from his slouch against the counter. Wait, the Vale farm? That's the land where they want to build the shopping complex. Ruby May nodded slowly. Same land. That boy's come home to destroy the very place where his roots go deepest. Makes you wonder what kind of pain a person carries to do such a thing. Dahlia's mind raced, connecting dots that painted a picture she hadn't expected. The way Sebastian had looked at the photograph behind her counter. The moment of vulnerability when he'd tasted her croissant. The tremor in his hands when he'd spoken about fights costing more than losing. He wasn't just another corporate predator circling her community. He was a wounded boy who'd grown up to become the very thing that had destroyed his childhood. I need to find him, Dahlia said suddenly, pulling her hands from the dough and reaching for a towel. Dahlia, honey, William said carefully, what exactly are you planning to do? I don't know yet. But if Ruby May's right, if he's got roots here, then maybe there's more to this story than corporate greed. Maybe there's a way to reach the boy who used to come here for cookies. Tommy caught her arm as she moved toward the door. And if you're wrong? If this is just a calculated business move and you're reading more into it than exists? Dahlia looked around at the faces gathered in her bakery, people who'd trusted her with their celebrations and their sorrows, who'd made her little shop the heart of their community. Then she thought about Sebastian Vale, about the pain she'd glimpsed behind his ice-blue eyes, about the way he'd closed his eyes when he tasted love in her croissant. Then I'll know I tried everything, she said. But I don't think I'm wrong. The Magnolia Creek Inn sat at the edge of downtown like a grand dame presiding over her domain. Built in the 1890s, it was the kind of place that attracted weekend tourists with its wraparound porches and antique charm. It was also the only place in town sophisticated enough to house a man like Sebastian Vale. Dahlia found him in the inn's small restaurant, sitting alone at a table by the window with his laptop open and a plate of untouched food growing cold beside him. He'd traded his morning suit for dark jeans and a button-down shirt that made him look younger, more approachable, but no less out of place in their small town. Mr. Vale? He looked up from his screen, and she watched surprise flicker across his features before he could school them back into professional neutrality. Ms. Brooks. I wasn't expecting to see you until Friday. May I sit? He gestured to the chair across from him with the kind of wary politeness reserved for potentially dangerous conversations. Dahlia settled herself, suddenly conscious of the flour still dusting her jeans and the fact that she probably smelled like cinnamon and hard work. I've been thinking about what you said this morning, she began, her hands folded carefully in her lap. About fights costing more than losing. Sebastian's fingers stilled on his keyboard. And? I think you know more about losing than most people realize. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Outside the window, Magnolia Creek's main street buzzed with late afternoon activity, children walking home from school, shopkeepers sweeping their sidewalks, neighbors stopping to chat on corners. The rhythm of small-town life that had remained unchanged for decades. Ruby May Washington remembers you, Dahlia said quietly. She remembers a little boy who came to my bakery every Saturday morning with his grandmother. She remembers when the Vale family lost their farm. Sebastian's hands moved to close his laptop with deliberate precision. When he looked at her again, his expression was carefully blank, but she could see the tension in the line of his shoulders. Ruby May Washington has an excellent memory. She also has a good heart. She's worried about that little boy who disappeared all those years ago, wondering what happened to him. That little boy grew up, Sebastian said, his voice carrying an edge sharp enough to cut. He learned that sentiment doesn't protect you from foreclosure. That loving a place doesn't give you the right to keep it. That sometimes the only way to survive is to become stronger than the forces that try to destroy you. Is that what this is? Dahlia leaned forward, searching his face for cracks in the armor. You becoming stronger than the forces that destroyed your family? This is business, Ms. Brooks. Pure and simple. Nothing about this feels pure or simple to me. She gestured toward the window, toward the street where his grandmother had once walked him to buy cookies every Saturday. You're asking me to sell the bakery where you learned what it felt like to be cared for, to make way for a development on the land where your family once lived. How is any of that simple? Sebastian stood abruptly, moving to the window with his back to her. In the golden late afternoon light, she could see the tension in every line of his body, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. You want to know what's simple? His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of old pain. What's simple is that my grandmother died in a nursing home in Atlanta because we couldn't afford to keep her in her own house after they took the farm. What's simple is that I was 12 years old when I learned that loving something doesn't mean you get to keep it. Dahlia felt her heart crack open at the raw honesty in his voice. She rose and moved to stand beside him at the window, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough to see the muscle jumping in his jaw. I'm sorry, she said softly. I'm sorry that happened to you and your family. Sorry doesn't rebuild what's lost. No, but it's a start. And sometimes understanding the wound is the first step toward healing it. Sebastian turned to look at her then, and in his eyes she saw the boy Ruby May remembered, scared, angry, determined never to be powerless again. But she also saw the man he'd become, successful and driven and completely alone. You think you understand? His laugh was bitter. You think your small-town psychology can fix 23 years of reality? I think, Dahlia said carefully, that you're fighting the wrong war. You're trying to prove you're stronger than the people who hurt you by becoming exactly like them. But strength isn't about having the power to destroy things, Sebastian. It's about having the courage to build them. The sound of his first name on her lips seemed to surprise them both. The formal distance they'd maintained all day collapsed in an instant, leaving them standing too close, breathing the same air, aware of each other in ways that had nothing to do with business negotiations. You don't know what you're talking about, he said, but his voice had lost its edge. Then tell me. Help me understand. For a moment, she thought he might. She could see him wavering, caught between the boy who'd been hurt and the man who'd learned to hurt others first. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Then his phone buzzed against the table, shattering the moment like dropped glass. Sebastian moved away from her to check the message, and when he looked up, his corporate mask was firmly back in place. My partner's arriving tomorrow, he said, his voice once again professionally neutral. James Morrison from the main office. He'll be expecting to see significant progress on the acquisition timeline. And if there isn't any progress? Then the timeline accelerates. And your options become much more limited. Dahlia nodded, accepting the threat for what it was while filing away everything she'd learned about the man behind it. Sebastian? He paused in gathering his laptop and papers. That little boy who came to my bakery every Saturday morning? He's welcome there any time. No business discussions, no ultimatums. Just cookies and conversation, if he ever wants to remember what it felt like to be cared for. She left him standing in the golden light of the inn's restaurant, surrounded by the ghosts of his childhood and the weight of impossible choices. But as she walked back toward her bakery through the familiar streets of downtown Magnolia Creek, Dahlia carried with her the memory of that moment when his armor had cracked open. She'd seen the real Sebastian Vale, the wounded boy behind the corporate success story. And she'd felt the electric pull between them, the undeniable awareness that this was about much more than real estate and development deals. The war for her bakery was far from over. But now she understood that the real battle wasn't between her community and his corporation. It was between the boy Sebastian had been and the man he'd forced himself to become. And somehow, inexplicably, she'd become the catalyst for a reckoning 23 years in the making. The question was whether either of them would survive what came next. That evening, as storm clouds gathered over Magnolia Creek like an omen, Dahlia stood in her kitchen preparing for the long night ahead. The town council meeting had been postponed due to severe weather warnings, giving her one more day to find a solution that seemed to slip further from her grasp with each passing hour. But as thunder rolled across the darkening sky and the first drops of rain began to fall against her windows, she found herself thinking not about business strategies or legal maneuvers, but about the pain she'd seen in Sebastian's eyes when he'd spoken about his grandmother. Some wounds ran deeper than financial statements. Some fights were about more than money or power or progress. And sometimes, the person who walked into your life as an enemy turned out to be the one person who could help you understand your own heart. The storm was coming, in more ways than one. But Dahlia Brooks had never backed down from a fight worth having. And Sebastian Vale, whether he knew it or not, was about to discover that some things were indeed stronger than they appeared. Chapter 3. The storm hit Magnolia Creek like a living thing, all fury and electricity and the kind of power that made humans remember how small they really were. By 9 o'clock that night, the wind was howling through the streets like a banshee, and the rain came down in sheets that turned the world into a watercolor painting left out in the weather. Dahlia had been in her bakery since 7, working by the light of her backup generator to prepare tomorrow's bread. The town council meeting might have been postponed, but life went on. People would still need their morning coffee and comfort food, especially after a night like this. She was elbow-deep in sourdough starter when she heard the pounding on her front door. Not the polite knock of a neighbor seeking shelter, but the desperate hammering of someone fighting the storm. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could make out a tall figure hunched against the wind. When lightning flashed, illuminating the street in stark black and white, she saw him clearly. Sebastian Vale, soaked to the skin and looking nothing like the polished corporate shark who'd invaded her sanctuary that morning. Dahlia rushed to unlock the door, and he practically fell through it, bringing with him the scent of rain and something wilder, ozone and desperation and the particular energy that came from running through a storm. "What are you doing out in this weather?" she demanded, grabbing a clean kitchen towel from behind the counter. "Car broke down about a mile from here," Sebastian said, accepting the towel with hands that weren't quite steady. "Phone's dead, and every other business on the street is closed. You could have stayed at the inn. I was walking back from..." He paused, running the towel through his wet hair. "I needed air. Time to think. The storm came up faster than I expected." Dahlia watched him try to dry himself off, noting the way his expensive shirt clung to his shoulders, the way his usually perfect hair curled when wet. Without the armor of his suits and professional polish, he looked younger, more human. More like the boy Ruby May remembered. "I'll call Tommy to come get you," she offered, reaching for her phone. "Lines are down," Sebastian said. "I tried calling from the pay phone outside the hardware store. Nothing's working." As if to emphasize his point, the lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness broken only by the emergency lighting from her battery-powered work lamps. The storm's fury intensified, rain lashing against the windows with renewed violence. "Looks like you're stuck here for a while," Dahlia said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the way her pulse had quickened. Being alone with Sebastian Vale in the intimate darkness of her kitchen felt dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "I can wait in the front area. I don't want to interfere with your work." "Don't be ridiculous." Dahlia moved toward the cabinet where she kept her emergency candles, hyper-aware of his presence in the small space. "Besides, I could use the company. Storms like this make me nervous when I'm alone." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Dahlia had weathered countless storms in this bakery, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms of her work. But something about this night, about having Sebastian here in her sanctuary while nature raged outside, made her feel exposed and vulnerable in ways she couldn't name. She lit several pillar candles, placing them around the kitchen until the space glowed with warm, flickering light. In the gentle illumination, the bakery transformed into something magical, shadows dancing on the walls, the scent of yeast and cinnamon mixing with the petrichor scent Sebastian had brought in from the storm. "Can I help?" he asked, surprising her. Dahlia looked at him, this man who'd come to destroy her world, standing in her kitchen offering assistance while wearing a $200 shirt and shoes that probably cost more than most people's rent. The incongruity should have been funny, but instead it felt profound, like a small crack opening in the wall between their two worlds. "Do you know how to knead bread?" Sebastian's smile was rueful. "I know how to make deals and close acquisitions. I'm not sure those skills translate to baking." "They don't," Dahlia agreed, moving to wash her hands at the small sink. "Baking requires patience, intuition, and the willingness to trust in things you can't control. It's the opposite of corporate strategy." "Sounds like something I could learn." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that went far beyond bread dough. Dahlia felt her breath catch as she turned to face him, suddenly aware that they were standing closer than they had been all day, that the storm had stripped away the formal boundaries that had defined their earlier interactions. "Wash your hands," she said softly. "I'll teach you." Sebastian moved to the sink, rolling up his sleeves to reveal forearms that were stronger than his expensive suits had suggested. Dahlia found herself watching the way water dripped from his fingers, the way he scrubbed his hands with the same methodical precision he probably brought to everything in his life. When he turned back to her, she was holding a mound of dough that felt warm and alive in her hands. "The secret to good bread," she began, moving to stand beside him at the work surface, "is understanding that you're working with something living. The yeast, the way gluten develops, the timing of each rise, it's all about respecting the process and working with it, not trying to force it." She placed the dough between them and covered his hands with hers, guiding his movements as they began to knead. His fingers were long and elegant, unused to this kind of physical work, but he followed her lead with surprising grace. "Push with the heel of your hand," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Then fold it back over itself. Like this." The intimacy of the moment wrapped around them like the warm air from the ovens. Their hands moved together in the ancient rhythm of bread making, their bodies close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, could smell the subtle cologne that had somehow survived his soaking in the rain. "Why do you do this?" Sebastian asked quietly, his voice rough with something that might have been emotion. "Stay up all night making bread for people who might not even appreciate what goes into it." Dahlia considered the question as they worked, the dough growing smoother and more elastic under their combined efforts. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the windows, but inside the candlelit kitchen, she felt safe in a way that surprised her. "My grandmother used to say that feeding people is the most basic form of love," she said finally. "When you put your hands in dough, when you measure and mix and wait for the rise, you're putting hope into the world. You're saying that tomorrow will come, and when it does, people will need sustenance and comfort and the reminder that someone cares enough to get up before dawn to make sure they have both." Sebastian's hands stilled under hers. When she looked up at him, she saw something raw and unguarded in his expression, as if her words had touched a place he'd thought was sealed off forever. "I remember," he said, so quietly she almost didn't hear him over the rain. "My grandmother's kitchen smelled like this. Like yeast and vanilla and home. Tell me about her." For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. They continued kneading in silence, their movements synchronized, their breathing matched to the rhythm of the work. But gradually, haltingly, he began to speak. "Evelyn Vale. She was fierce, I guess. Tiny woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she could make grown men apologize for cursing in her presence. She raised me after my parents died when I was 8. Dahlia's hands stilled. "I didn't know you'd lost your parents." "Car accident. Black ice on a winter road." Sebastian's voice was matter-of-fact, but she could hear the old pain underneath. Grandma Evie took me in without question. Made me help her in the garden, taught me to appreciate simple things. She used to say that a person's wealth wasn't measured in dollars but in the number of people who would miss them when they were gone. She sounds wonderful. She was. Sebastian's laugh was bitter. Which is why losing the farm nearly killed her. For generations of her family had worked that land. She knew every tree, every field, every inch of soil. When the bank foreclosed, it was like watching someone die slowly. Dahlia felt tears prick at her eyes as she imagined a young Sebastian watching his grandmother's world collapse around them. What happened after you lost the farm? We moved to Atlanta. Grandma Evie got a job as a housekeeper for a wealthy family, and I went to a private school on scholarship. She sacrificed everything to give me opportunities she'd never had. Made sure I understood that education and ambition were the only things that could protect me from ever being powerless again. Is that why you became what you are? To make sure you'd never be powerless? Sebastian's hands pressed deeper into the dough, his movements becoming more aggressive. I became what I am because I learned that the world respects strength and nothing else. That if you're not the one making the deals, you're the one getting destroyed by them. So you decided to be the destroyer instead of the destroyed. I decided to survive. The words hung heavy between them, carrying the weight of choices made by a frightened boy who'd grown into a man afraid of ever being vulnerable again. Dahlia felt her heart break a little for that scared 12-year-old who'd learned all the wrong lessons about strength and safety. Sebastian, she said softly, her hands covering his as they both stilled in their work. Survival isn't the same thing as living. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and in the candlelight she could see everything he usually kept hidden, the loneliness, the fear, the desperate hunger for the kind of connection he'd convinced himself he didn't need. You don't understand, he whispered. When you lose everything once, you spend the rest of your life making sure it never happens again. But what if protecting yourself from loss means you never allow yourself to have anything worth losing? The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications neither of them was ready to face. They stood in the golden circle of candlelight, their hands still joined in the dough, their hearts beating in rhythm with the storm outside. And then, without either of them planning it, without any conscious decision being made, Sebastian leaned down and Dahlia rose up to meet him halfway. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, like a question being asked in a foreign language. It tasted of rain and possibility, of walls crumbling and defenses failing. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, both staring at each other with something like wonder. This is insane, Sebastian whispered, but he didn't step away. Completely, Dahlia agreed, but she didn't move either. Outside, the storm reached its crescendo, wind and rain battering the building with elemental fury. But inside the warmth of her kitchen, surrounded by the scent of rising bread and the soft glow of candlelight, Dahlia felt something shift in the very foundations of her world. She was falling for the enemy. Falling for the man who'd come to destroy everything she loved. And from the way Sebastian was looking at her, like she was salvation and damnation wrapped in flour-dusted skin, he was falling too. The bread dough sat forgotten between them, perfectly kneaded and ready for its first rise. Much like the feelings growing between two people who should have been enemies but were discovering they might be something else entirely. Something dangerous. Something beautiful. Something that could change everything, if they were brave enough to let it. Chapter 4. The morning after the storm dawned clear and bright, as if nature itself was embarrassed by the previous night's dramatics. Magnolia Creek sparkled in the early sunlight, washed clean and somehow more beautiful for having survived the tempest. Dahlia woke in the chair beside her ovens where she dozed fitfully after Sebastian finally left around 3 in the morning. The bread they'd kneaded together had risen perfectly during the night, ready to be shaped and baked into loaves that would feed her community. But as she stretched the kinks from her neck and tried to make sense of what had happened between them, she wondered if anything would ever feel normal again. The kiss. God, the kiss. She could still taste it, still feel the electric shock that had run through her when his lips touched hers. Still remember the way he'd looked at her afterward, like she was something miraculous and terrifying that he couldn't quite believe was real. The front door chimed, and Dahlia's heart leaped before she could stop it. But it was only Tommy, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd been worried sick. "Please tell me you're okay," he said, setting the coffee on her counter and scanning her face for signs of damage. "When the storm knocked out power and I couldn't reach you, I imagined all kinds of disasters." "I'm fine," Dahlia said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Just tired. The backup generator kept the ovens running, so I worked through most of the night." Tommy's dark eyes were too knowing, too familiar with her moods and mannerisms for her to hide much from him. "And Sebastian Vale? I saw his car at Patterson's garage this morning, being towed for repairs." Heat bloomed in Dahlia's cheeks before she could stop it. "He got caught in the storm. Stayed here until it passed." "Here? In your bakery? All night?" "Tommy." "I'm not judging," he said quickly, but there was something in his voice, hurt, maybe, or disappointment, that made her chest tighten with guilt. "I just want to make sure you know what you're doing. That man isn't just some guy who's interested in you, Dahlia. He's here to destroy everything you've built." "I know that. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're falling for the person who's trying to take away your dream." The words hit harder than they should have, partly because Tommy was right and partly because the concern in his voice reminded her of all the ways he'd been there for her over the years. All the times he'd supported her dreams, listened to her fears, been the steady presence she could count on when everything else felt uncertain. "It's complicated," she said finally. "It's really not." Tommy moved closer, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "He's going to hurt you, Dahlia. Maybe not intentionally, but when this is all over and his company has what they want, you're going to be the one left picking up the pieces." Before Dahlia could respond, the front door chimed again. This time, it was Sebastian who walked through, looking every inch the polished businessman in a fresh suit and perfectly styled hair. If not for the slightly uncertain way his eyes found hers, she might have wondered if the previous night had been a dream. The tension in the room ratcheted up immediately. Tommy straightened to his full height, moving subtly between Dahlia and Sebastian in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. Sebastian's jaw tightened as he took in the scene, the coffee cups, the intimate conversation he'd interrupted, the way Tommy's hands lingered on Dahlia's shoulders. "Mr. Vale," Tommy said, his voice professionally polite but unmistakably cold. "Mr. Lee." Sebastian's tone matched Tommy's exactly. "I hope the storm didn't cause too much damage to your shop." "Nothing I can't handle. Thanks for your concern." The subtext crackling between the two men was thick enough to cut with a knife. Dahlia felt caught between them, acutely aware that she was the prize they were circling around without acknowledging it directly. "Sebastian," she said, stepping out from behind Tommy's protective stance. "Is everything all right? Your car? Being repaired? I actually came to." He paused, glancing at Tommy before continuing. "I wanted to thank you for last night. For letting me wait out the storm here." "Of course. Anyone would have done the same." "Would they?" Sebastian's smile was slight, but there was something warm in his eyes that made her pulse quicken. "I'm not sure many people would have been as generous to someone who'd spent the day threatening their livelihood." Tommy made a sound that might have been a snort. "Threatening is putting it mildly." Sebastian's attention shifted to Tommy, and Dahlia could practically see the corporate shark swimming beneath the surface of his polite exterior. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Lee. Which is why I'm here to discuss a possible alternative to our current timeline." "Alternative?" Dahlia's heart stuttered with hope she didn't dare trust. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, about the historical significance of this area. It occurred to me that there might be ways to incorporate existing structures into the development plan, rather than simply demolishing everything." Tommy's expression was pure skepticism. And what brought about this sudden attack of conscience? Sebastian's smile turned sharp. Practical considerations, Mr. Lee. Historical preservation can be excellent marketing for upscale developments. Gives them character, authenticity. Things that money usually can't buy. The words should have been encouraging, but something in Sebastian's tone set Dahlia's teeth on edge. This wasn't the man who'd kissed her in the candlelight, who'd shared stories about his grandmother while learning to knead bread. This was the corporate negotiator, smooth and calculating and completely in control. What kind of incorporation? She asked carefully. We'd preserve the facade of this building, possibly convert it into a boutique space within the larger retail complex. You could maintain a smaller bakery operation, though obviously the scope would need to be scaled back to fit the new framework. Scaled back how? Reduced square footage, limited operating hours, integration with the overall retail management structure. You'd essentially become a tenant in the development rather than an independent business owner. The hope that had flickered to life in Dahlia's chest died a slow, painful death. He was offering her a cage painted to look like freedom, a consolation prize that would let him claim he'd preserved the bakery while gutting everything that made it special. That's not preservation, she said quietly. That's museumification. You want to turn my bakery into a quaint attraction for tourists, strip away everything authentic about it and package it as nostalgia. I want to find a solution that works for everyone. No, you want to find a solution that makes your job easier while still getting you what you want. Dahlia's voice was rising, powered by disappointment and the growing realization that the connection she'd felt with him the night before might have been nothing more than wishful thinking. You want to be able to tell people you saved the historic bakery while actually destroying everything it represents. Sebastian's expression hardened. I'm trying to offer you a compromise, Dahlia. A way for you to keep some version of your business while accepting the reality of progress. Progress. She spat the word like it tasted bitter. You keep using that word like it means something noble. But all you're really talking about is profit. Your profit, at the expense of my community. Your community that's struggling to survive? Your community where half the businesses on Main Street have been empty for years? I'm offering economic revitalization, jobs, growth. Things this town desperately needs. We need growth that builds on what we have, not growth that erases our history to make room for generic commerce. History doesn't pay bills, Dahlia. Sentiment doesn't create jobs. And money doesn't create soul. The words exploded out of her with all the force of her frustration and hurt. You can build your shopping complex and your chain stores and your parking lots, but you'll never create what this place has. Genuine community, authentic connection, the kind of belonging that actually matters. Sebastian stepped closer, his blue eyes flashing with something that might have been anger or might have been pain. You think I don't understand community? You think I don't know what belonging feels like? I think you've spent so long protecting yourself from being hurt that you've forgotten how to value anything that can't be measured on a balance sheet. The words hung between them like a thrown gauntlet. Tommy watched the exchange with growing alarm, clearly sensing undercurrents he couldn't fully understand. The air in the bakery felt charged with more than just professional disagreement. There was something personal and raw happening between Dahlia and Sebastian that went far beyond business negotiations. You don't know what you're talking about, Sebastian said finally, his voice deadly quiet. Don't I? Then tell me, Sebastian, when's the last time you had a home? When's the last time you belonged somewhere that wasn't dependent on your bank account or your professional success? When's the last time someone cared about you just because of who you are, not what you can do for them? The silence that followed was deafening. Sebastian stared at her like she'd struck him, his face pale beneath his expensive tan. For a moment, she thought she saw the wounded boy again, the one who'd lost everything and spent his adult life making sure it never happened again. But then his professional mask slammed back into place with almost audible force. This conversation is over, he said. You have until Friday to decide whether you want to accept our revised offer or face the consequences of refusing it entirely. Either way, this project moves forward on schedule." He turned and walked toward the door with sharp, angry strides. But at the threshold, he paused and looked back at her. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "last night was a mistake. For both of us." Then he was gone, leaving Dahlia standing in the wreckage of whatever fragile connection they'd built during the storm. The bakery felt suddenly cold despite the warmth from the ovens, empty despite Tommy's presence beside her. "Dahlia," Tommy said gently, his hand warm on her arm. "Are you okay?" She wanted to say yes. Wanted to pretend that Sebastian's words hadn't cut straight through to the heart of her growing feelings for him. Wanted to act like his rejection was just business and didn't feel like a personal betrayal. Instead, she found herself fighting back tears as she realized that Tommy had been right all along. Sebastian Vale was going to hurt her. And the worst part was, she'd known it was coming and fallen for him anyway. Chapter 5. James Morrison filled Dahlia's bakery the way a storm cloud fills the sky, with the promise of destruction and the absolute certainty that there was nowhere to run. He was older than Sebastian, maybe 55, with silver hair and the kind of expensive grooming that spoke of serious money and serious power. But it was his eyes that made Dahlia's skin crawl. Cold, calculating, completely devoid of the warmth she'd glimpsed in Sebastian even during their worst moments. "Mr. Morrison," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the alarm bells ringing in her head. "Sebastian didn't mention you were coming. Sebastian has been distracted lately." Morrison's smile was sharp as a blade. "I thought it was time I personally assessed the situation here in Magnolia Creek." He moved through her bakery like he was already mentally demolishing it, his gaze cataloging every detail with the efficiency of a wrecking ball operator. When he reached the display case, he stopped and stared at the photographs lining the walls, 5 generations of community celebrations, all centered around the warmth and comfort of her family's bakery. "Charming," he said, but the word sounded like an insult in his mouth. "Very quaint. Is there something I can help you with, Mr. Morrison?" "Actually, yes." He turned back to her with that predatory smile. "I understand Sebastian offered you some sort of preservation compromise. Frankly, I'm here to withdraw that offer." Dahlia felt the blood drain from her face. "Withdraw it? The timeline has accelerated. We need to break ground within 6 weeks to stay on schedule with our other projects. Preserving existing structures would add months to the development process." Morrison shrugged as if he were discussing the weather. "It's simply not practical anymore." "But Sebastian said." "Sebastian said a lot of things he wasn't authorized to promise." Morrison's voice carried the particular cruelty of someone who enjoyed delivering bad news. "He's young, idealistic. Sometimes he lets personal feelings interfere with business judgment." Personal feelings. The words hit Dahlia like physical blows, confirming what she'd suspected but hadn't dared hope, that Sebastian's feelings for her were real, that their connection hadn't been one-sided. "Where is Sebastian?" she asked. "Dealing with other aspects of the project. He won't be involved in the final negotiations." Morrison pulled out a folder thick with legal documents. "Which brings me to why I'm here. This is our final offer, Ms. Brooks. 20% above market value for your property, with a 60-day closing timeline." Dahlia stared at the folder without touching it. "And if I refuse?" "Then we proceed with eminent domain proceedings. The City Council has already approved the development as being in the public interest. Your refusal would simply complicate things unnecessarily." Eminent domain? The words felt foreign in her mouth, like speaking a language she'd never learned. The legal process by which governments can acquire private property for public use, with just compensation of course. It's completely legitimate, though admittedly more expensive and time-consuming than a voluntary sale. Morrison's smile turned genuinely nasty. But don't worry, Ms. Brooks. You'll still receive fair market value for your property. You just won't have any choice in the matter. The casual cruelty of it stole her breath. They could simply take her bakery, take everything her family had built, and the law would help them do it. All her fighting, all her passionate defense of community and history and connection, none of it mattered when faced with the cold machinery of legal power and unlimited money. You can't, she whispered. We can. We will. The only question is whether you want to make this easy or difficult for yourself. Dahlia sank onto one of the stools behind her counter, her legs suddenly too weak to support her weight. In her mind, she could see the future Morrison was describing, bulldozers rolling through downtown Magnolia Creek, century-old buildings reduced to rubble, her grandmother's bakery becoming nothing more than a memory preserved in old photographs. I need time to think. You have until 5 o'clock today. Sign the papers, or we file the eminent domain petition on Monday morning. Morrison tucked the folder under his arm, already moving toward the door. Oh, and Ms. Brooks? Don't expect Sebastian to ride to your rescue. He knows which side his bread is buttered on, if you'll pardon the expression. After he left, Dahlia sat alone in her bakery, surrounded by the scent of rising bread and the weight of impossible choices. Outside, Magnolia Creek went about its morning routine. Shopkeepers opening their doors, neighbors greeting each other on the sidewalks, children walking to school past buildings that had sheltered their families for generations. All of it soon to be swept away in the name of progress and profit. The front door chimed again, and this time it was Tommy, carrying coffee and wearing an expression of barely controlled rage. I just saw Morrison leaving, he said without preamble. Please tell me he wasn't here delivering bad news. Worse than bad. Dahlia's voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. They're withdrawing the preservation offer. It's sell now or face eminent domain proceedings. Tommy set down the coffee with enough force to slosh it over the rim. Those bastards. They planned this all along, didn't they? The compromise offer was just theater, a way to make themselves look reasonable before they brought out the legal weapons. I don't know. Maybe. But even as she said it, Dahlia found herself thinking about Sebastian's face when he'd made the preservation offer. The uncertainty in his voice, the way he'd seemed to be making it up as he went along. Had he been trying to find a real solution, or had it all been part of some elaborate corporate strategy? Where's Sebastian in all this? Tommy asked, echoing her own thoughts. Morrison says he's not involved in the final negotiations. Convenient. He gets to keep his hands clean while his partner does the dirty work. Tommy. Dahlia wanted to defend Sebastian, wanted to believe that his absence meant he was fighting for her behind the scenes. But the evidence was mounting against him, and her own wounded heart made it hard to trust her instincts. What are you going to do? Before Dahlia could answer, the door chimed a third time. This time it was Jasmine, her young face flushed with excitement and determination. I've been doing research, she announced, pulling out her laptop and setting it on the counter. Legal research, historical research, everything I could find about property rights and development law. Jazz, honey, I appreciate it, but... Listen to me. Jasmine's voice carried the particular intensity of someone who discovered something important. I found something about the original land grants for this area. Something that might change everything. She opened her laptop and pulled up a scanned document that looked ancient and official. This is the original deed for the land where the bakery sits, granted to the Whitman family in 1886. But here's the interesting part, there's a covenant attached to the deed. A covenant? A legal restriction on how the land can be used. The Whitman family were abolitionists, and they put a clause in the deed stating that the land could never be used for any purpose that would harm the local community or destroy its character. Jasmine's eyes were bright with triumph. It's still legally binding. Any development would have to honor that covenant. Tommy leaned over the laptop screen, frowning as he tried to read the faded legal language. But would that actually stop them? Wouldn't they just argue that the development serves the community? That's where it gets interesting, Jasmine continued. I also found records showing that Sebastian's family, the Valles, are direct descendants of the Whitman family. Sebastian has legal standing to enforce the covenant. In fact, he might be the only person who does. Dahlia stared at her sister, pieces of a puzzle clicking together in her mind. You're saying Sebastian could stop the development if he wanted to? I'm saying Sebastian might be the only person who can stop it. But only if he's willing to go against his own company to do it. The implications hung heavy in the air between them. If Jasmine was right, then Sebastian held the power to save the bakery, to save the entire downtown district. All he had to do was choose community over corporation, history over profit. Choose her over his carefully constructed life of wealth and power. I have to find him, Dahlia said, already reaching for her coat. Dahlia, wait. Tommy caught her arm, his face creased with concern. What if this doesn't change anything? What if he already knows about the covenant and just doesn't care? Then at least I'll know I tried everything. She pulled free from his grasp, her heart pounding with desperate hope. But if there's even a chance that he doesn't know, that this information could make a difference. Where are you going to look for him? Dahlia paused, thinking about everywhere she'd seen Sebastian over the past week. The inn, the rental car parked across from her bakery, the coffee shop where he'd worked on his laptop. Then it hit her. There was one place he might go if he was struggling with impossible choices, one place that held the key to understanding both his past and his future. I know where he is. The old Vale farm sat 3 miles outside Magnolia Creek, down a winding country road that was more memory than pavement. Dahlia had been here only once before, years ago on a school field trip to learn about local agricultural history. But as she drove through the rusted gates and up the overgrown drive, she felt like she was traveling back in time. The farmhouse was still standing, barely. Weather-beaten and empty, with broken windows that stared out over fields gone wild with weeds and neglect. But in the afternoon light, she could imagine what it had once been, a working farm where a boy named Sebastian had learned about roots and belonging before the world taught him that neither could be trusted. She found him sitting on the farmhouse steps, still wearing his expensive suit but looking somehow smaller than she'd ever seen him. Lost. When he heard her car, he looked up with an expression that was equal parts surprise and resignation. "How did you find me?" he asked as she approached. "Lucky guess." Dahlia climbed the steps and settled beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body but careful not to touch. "Morrison came to see me this morning." Sebastian's jaw clenched. "I figured he would. He withdrew the preservation offer. Said you weren't authorized to make it in the first place." "I wasn't." Sebastian's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "I was improvising, trying to find some middle ground that would let me sleep at night." "James doesn't believe in middle ground." "So you knew he was going to pull the offer?" "I knew it was a possibility. Hell, I knew it was probable." "James doesn't make promises he can't control, and preserving your bakery would have complicated everything else we're trying to accomplish here." Dahlia studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched and unclenched on his knees. "Is that why you're here? Trying to figure out how to sleep at night?" Sebastian turned to look at her then, and in his eyes she saw everything he'd been trying to hide, the guilt, the longing, the desperate conflict between the man he'd become and the boy he'd once been. "I'm here because this is where it all started," he said quietly. "The farm, the foreclosure, the decision to never be powerless again. I thought if I came back, if I sat where my grandmother used to sit and looked out over the land that was supposed to be our legacy, maybe I'd remember why I'm doing this." "And do you? Remember why?" "That's the problem." Sebastian's voice was rough with emotion. "I can't remember anymore if I'm doing this to honor her memory or to destroy it." Dahlia felt her heart crack open at the raw honesty in his words. Without thinking, she reached for his hand, covering his clenched fist with her palm. He didn't pull away, but she felt him tense at the contact. "Tell me about her," she said softly. "About your grandmother, about what this place meant to your family." For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. The wind rustled through the overgrown fields, carrying the scent of autumn and the promise of winter's coming sleep. Then, haltingly, Sebastian began to speak. "She grew apples," he said, gesturing toward the gnarled trees that still dotted the property. "Best apples in 3 counties, according to her. Every fall, she'd make apple butter and apple pies and apple cider, and she'd take them to the farmer's market in town. I used to help her, carrying baskets, making change, charming the customers with my gap-toothed grin." Dahlia could picture it, a young Sebastian with dirt under his fingernails and apple juice on his chin, learning about hard work and community connections from a grandmother who understood both. "She sounds wonderful. She was everything to me after my parents died. Patient when I had nightmares, fierce when the kids at school made fun of my second-hand clothes, endlessly supportive of every crazy dream I ever had." Sebastian's voice broke slightly. "She used to say that a person's real wealth wasn't measured in money but in the number of lives they'd touched with kindness." "What happened? When you lost the farm?" Sebastian's hand turned palm up under hers, their fingers intertwining without conscious thought. "Drought first, then a late frost that killed most of the apple crop. Grandma Evie had been borrowing against the farm for years to keep things running, and when the harvest failed 2 years in a row, the bank called in the loans. She must have been devastated. She never showed it. At least not to me. But I found her crying in the barn one night, surrounded by empty apple crates and staring at foreclosure notices. I was 12 years old, and I'd never seen my grandmother cry before. It terrified me more than anything I'd ever experienced." Dahlia squeezed his hand, imagining a frightened boy watching his whole world crumble around him. "What did you do?" "I promised her I'd get the farm back someday. That I'd make enough money to buy back our land and fix everything that had gone wrong." Sebastian's laugh was hollow. "She told me that some things, once lost, can never be reclaimed. That the only way forward was to build something new, something better, something that honored the past without being trapped by it." "Sounds like she was very wise." "She was. Which is why I can't figure out what she'd think of what I've become." Sebastian turned to look at Dahlia fully, his blue eyes bright with unshed tears. "I built everything she told me to build: success, security, the power to never be helpless again. But somewhere along the way, I forgot about the other part. About honoring the past, about touching lives with kindness." "It's not too late," Dahlia whispered. "It's never too late to remember who you're supposed to be. Isn't it? I'm here to destroy the very town where my grandmother taught me about community. I'm about to tear down buildings where she shopped and worshipped and lived, all in the name of progress that would have broken her heart." Dahlia felt tears prick at her eyes as she realized the depth of Sebastian's internal struggle. He wasn't just fighting her and her community, he was fighting himself, fighting 23 years of carefully constructed defenses against the vulnerability that had nearly destroyed him as a child. "Sebastian," she said softly, "there's something you need to know. Something my sister discovered about the land rights here." She told him about Jasmine's research, about the covenant attached to the original deed, about his legal standing as a descendant of the Whitman family. With each word, she watched his expression change from confusion to understanding to something that looked like wonder. "You're saying I could stop the development?" "I'm saying you might be the only person who can stop it. But only if you're willing to fight your own company to do it." Sebastian was quiet for a long time, staring out over the fields where his ancestors had grown apples and built dreams. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she almost didn't hear him. "She's buried here, you know. My grandmother. In the family cemetery behind the apple orchard. I haven't visited her grave since the day we left. Do you want to see it now?" Sebastian nodded, not trusting his voice. Together, they walked through the overgrown fields toward a small rise where ancient apple trees still bore fruit despite years of neglect. Behind the orchard, protected by a low stone wall, lay a small cemetery where generations of Valles and Whitmans rested in the soil they'd loved. Evelyn Vale's headstone was simple granite, weathered but still readable. "Beloved grandmother and friend," it read. "She touched lives with kindness." Sebastian stared at the inscription for a long time, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. When Dahlia reached for him, he collapsed into her arms like a man drowning, all his careful control finally cracking open. "I'm sorry, Grandma Evie," he whispered against Dahlia's shoulder. "I'm so sorry for what I've become." Dahlia held him as he grieved, for his grandmother, for his lost childhood, for all the years he'd spent running from the pain that had shaped him. And as the sun set over the fields where his family had once grown apples, she felt something shift in the very air around them. This was the moment of truth. The place where Sebastian Vale would have to choose between the armor that had protected him and the vulnerability that might save them all. The question was whether love would prove stronger than fear. Whether coming home would prove stronger than running away. Whether the boy who'd once promised to get the farm back could find the courage to save something even more precious, the community where his roots ran deeper than he'd ever dared remember. Chapter 6. The Magnolia Creek Town Council meeting that Friday night would be remembered for generations, not just for the decision that was made, but for the way it was made, and the man who stood up to make it. The community center was packed beyond capacity, with people spilling out into the hallways and crowding around the doors to hear what might be the final chapter in downtown Magnolia Creek's century-long story. Dahlia sat in the front row with Tommy on one side and Jasmine on the other, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. She hadn't seen Sebastian since they'd left the cemetery that afternoon. He'd driven away in his rental car without saying where he was going, leaving her with nothing but hope and the memory of his tears soaking into her sweater. For all she knew, he was already on a plane back to Atlanta, choosing the safety of his corporate life over the risk of standing up for what was right. "All rise," called Council Secretary Martha Davis, her voice barely audible over the nervous chatter filling the room. "The Magnolia Creek Town Council is now in session." Mayor Patricia Webb, a woman in her 60s who'd been navigating small-town politics since before Dahlia was born, took her seat behind the curved table that dominated the front of the room. To her left sat the 5 council members who would decide the fate of downtown's historic district. To her right sat James Morrison, his expensive suit and predatory smile making him look like a shark in a goldfish bowl. "Before we begin," Mayor Webb announced, "I want to remind everyone that this is a formal proceeding. We will hear presentations from both parties, allow for public comment, and then vote on the development proposal. Please keep your comments respectful and your emotions in check." Morrison stood first, his presentation as slick and polished as everything else about him. Charts showing job creation and tax revenue projections, architectural renderings of gleaming new retail spaces, testimonials from other communities that had embraced progress over sentiment. "Ladies and gentlemen," he concluded, "this development represents the future of Magnolia Creek. A future where your children won't have to leave town to find good jobs, where your tax base can support better schools and infrastructure, where your community can compete in the modern economy instead of becoming another quaint tourist stop that exists only in photographs." A smattering of applause followed his words, mostly from the business owners who'd been swayed by promises of increased foot traffic and economic growth. Then it was Dahlia's turn. She stood on unsteady legs, her speech carefully prepared but her heart hammering with the knowledge that these might be the last words she ever spoke in defense of her grandmother's legacy. "Council members, neighbors, friends," she began, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "Mr. Morrison is right about one thing, this decision is about the future of Magnolia Creek. But the question isn't whether we want a future. The question is what kind of future we want, and what we're willing to sacrifice to get it." She gestured toward the photographs she'd brought, images of 5 generations of community celebrations, all centered around the businesses and gathering places that Morrison wanted to demolish. These pictures tell the real story of our town's wealth. Not the kind that shows up on tax rolls or economic development charts, but the kind that can't be bought or sold or replaced once it's gone. The story of neighbors who know each other's names, of traditions passed down through families, of a place where people belong not because of what they own but because of who they are. Her voice was growing stronger now, powered by decades of love for the community that had shaped her. Mr. Morrison talks about progress as if it only moves in one direction, forward, faster, bigger, more profitable. But real progress honors where we've been while building where we're going. Real progress doesn't erase history, it builds on it. She spoke about her grandmother's recipes, about Ruby Mae Washington's stories, about the way her bakery had become a gathering place where joy and sorrow were shared equally over coffee and conversation. She spoke about Tommy's dedication to serving fair trade coffee that connected their small town to farmers around the world, about Honey Williams' tireless work to balance progress with preservation. "We're not against change," Dahlia said, her eyes sweeping across faces she'd known her entire life. "We're not against growth or opportunity or any of the good things Mr. Morrison promises. We're just asking that change honor who we are instead of erasing it. That growth build on our strengths instead of destroying them." She was approaching the end of her prepared remarks when the back doors of the community center opened with a bang that echoed through the suddenly silent room. Sebastian Vale walked in like a man going to war. But this wasn't the polished corporate executive who'd first entered her bakery a week ago. This Sebastian wore jeans and a simple button-down shirt, his expensive shoes replaced by work boots that looked like they'd actually walked through farm fields. His hair was slightly mussed, as if he'd been running his hands through it, and his blue eyes held a determination that made Dahlia's breath catch in her throat. Behind him walked a woman Dahlia didn't recognize, elderly, silver-haired, with the kind of quiet dignity that spoke of strength tested by time. And behind her came someone who made Dahlia's heart nearly stop beating. Ruby Mae Washington, leaning on her walker but moving with purpose, her weathered face set in an expression of fierce determination. "Mayor Webb," Sebastian said, his voice carrying clearly through the room despite the murmur of surprised conversation. "I request permission to address the council." "Mr. Vale," Morrison said sharply, half rising from his seat. "This is highly irregular. You're not scheduled to speak." "Actually," said the silver-haired woman, stepping forward with papers in her hand, "my grandson has every right to speak. As does any descendant of the original Whitman land grant holders." Mayor Webb looked confused. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't understand." "Allow me to introduce myself," the woman continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "I'm Margaret Cross, Sebastian's mother. And I've brought some documents that I believe will be of interest to this council." The room erupted in surprised chatter. Sebastian's mother? Dahlia felt her heart racing as pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known existed began clicking into place. "If I may," Sebastian said, moving to the front of the room with the easy confidence of someone who'd finally found his footing. "There are some things this council needs to know before they vote. Things about the legal status of the land in question, and my family's connection to it." Morrison's face had gone pale. "Sebastian, what do you think you're doing?" "The right thing," Sebastian replied, not even looking at his business partner. "For the first time in a very long time, James, I'm doing the right thing." Margaret Cross handed the documents to Mayor Webb while Sebastian continued speaking. 23 years ago, my family lost our farm to foreclosure. I was 12 years old, and I watched my grandmother's heart break as strangers took away everything we'd built. I swore that day that I'd never be powerless again, that I'd become rich enough and strong enough to prevent anyone from ever taking what was mine. His eyes found Dahlia's across the crowded room, and she saw everything in them: love, regret, determination, and the courage she'd been praying he would find. But somewhere along the way, I forgot the most important lesson my grandmother ever taught me. That real strength isn't about having the power to take things away from people. It's about having the courage to protect what matters, even when it costs you everything you think you want. Sebastian moved closer to the council table, his voice growing stronger with each word. The land that Vale Development wants to acquire for this project includes the original Whitman family homestead, granted in 1886 with a covenant that prohibits any use that would harm the local community or destroy its character. As a direct descendant of the Whitman family through my great-great-grandmother, I have legal standing to enforce that covenant. Morrison shot to his feet. Sebastian, you're out of line. We have contracts, obligations. We have an obligation to tell the truth, Sebastian cut him off. And the truth is that this development would violate a legally binding covenant that's been in place for more than a century. Mayor Webb was frantically scanning the documents Margaret Cross had provided. These appear to be authentic, she said slowly. But I'm not qualified to make a legal determination about their validity. Which is why, Sebastian continued, I'm formally challenging the development on behalf of the Whitman Family Trust. And as a principal in Vale Development Group, I'm withdrawing our company from this project effective immediately. The room exploded into chaos. Morrison was shouting about breach of contract and corporate obligations. Council members were talking over each other, trying to understand the legal implications. Community members were on their feet, some cheering, others demanding explanations. But through it all, Dahlia's attention was fixed on Sebastian. He stood calm and centered in the middle of the storm he'd created, his eyes never leaving her face. When their gazes met across the crowded room, she saw the boy he'd been and the man he'd chosen to become, and her heart filled with so much love she thought it might burst. Order! Mayor Webb was banging her gavel with increasing desperation. Order in this chamber. Gradually, the noise subsided enough for her to continue. Given these new developments, I believe we need to postpone this vote pending a full legal review of the documents presented tonight. You can't do this, Morrison snarled, his polished facade finally cracking. We have investors, timelines, contracts worth millions of dollars. What we have, said Ruby Mae Washington, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, is a community worth saving. And sometimes, young man, there are things more important than your contracts. She was looking directly at Sebastian as she spoke, and Dahlia saw him nod slightly, as if accepting both a challenge and a blessing from the woman who remembered him as a gap-toothed boy buying cookies every Saturday morning. The vote is postponed, Mayor Webb announced. Council will reconvene in 2 weeks after we've had time to review all relevant documents and legal opinions. As the crowd began to disperse, Dahlia found herself frozen in her seat, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. Sebastian had sacrificed his career, his business partnership, probably his financial security, to save her bakery. To save their community. To save them. She was still sitting there in stunned silence when a shadow fell across her. Looking up, she found Sebastian standing beside her chair, his expression uncertain despite the courage he'd shown moments before. Dahlia, he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the continuing chatter around them. Can we talk? She nodded, not trusting her voice, and let him help her to her feet. Together, they walked out of the community center into the cool night air, leaving behind the chaos and celebration and moving toward a conversation that would determine the rest of their lives. You came back, she said when they reached the quiet of the parking lot. I never really left. Sebastian's smile was rueful. I just got lost for a while. Lost in anger and fear and the need to prove I was stronger than the pain that shaped me. What changed your mind? You did. And my grandmother's grave, and my mother showing up at the inn with documents I never knew existed. Sebastian reached for her hands, holding them gently in his own. But mostly you, Dahlia. The way you saw through all my armor to the scared boy underneath. The way you fought for something bigger than yourself, even when fighting seemed hopeless. Sebastian, what you did in there, you could lose everything. I've already lost everything that mattered, he said softly. Lost it the day I chose fear over love, profit over connection, success over home. Tonight, I got the chance to choose differently. And Morrison? Your company? Sebastian's laugh was free of the bitterness that had colored it before. James can find another project, another town to develop. As for Vale Development Group, it was never really mine anyway. It was just another armor I built to protect myself from caring too much. So what happens now? Now I figure out how to rebuild a life based on what matters instead of what's safe. Sebastian's hands tightened on hers. And I hope that maybe, if you can forgive me for being such a coward for so long, you might let me rebuild it here. With you. Dahlia felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked at this man who'd walked into her life as an enemy and was standing here now as the answer to prayers she hadn't known how to pray. Are you sure? She whispered. Are you sure you want to give up everything you've built for a small-town life with a baker who can barely pay her bills? I'm sure that I love you, Sebastian said, his voice steady and certain. I'm sure that I've never felt more at home than I did kneading bread with you by candlelight. I'm sure that my grandmother would be proud of me for the first time in 23 years. He released one of her hands to cup her face, his thumb brushing away her tears. And I'm sure that some things are worth fighting for, even when fighting means losing everything you thought you wanted. When he kissed her, it tasted of promises and second chances, of walls coming down and hearts opening up. It tasted of flower and possibility, of storms weathered and morning light breaking through clouds. It tasted like coming home. 6 months later, Dahlia stood in the expanded kitchen of Brooks Bakery, watching Sebastian pull a tray of his grandmother's apple turnovers from the oven. He wore jeans and a flour-dusted apron, his expensive suits donated to charity and his corporate life a memory that felt like it belonged to someone else. The legal challenge to the development had succeeded, the covenant upheld by county courts and the land protected for future generations. Morrison had found another project in another town, one presumably without inconvenient historical protections or principled partners willing to choose community over profit. Vale Development Group had been dissolved, its assets distributed among various charitable organizations focused on historic preservation and community development. Sebastian had used his share to establish a fund for small business loans in rural communities, ensuring that other entrepreneurs like Dahlia would have the support they needed to pursue their dreams. Those smell exactly like Grandma Evie's, said Margaret Cross, who'd become a regular fixture in the bakery since moving back to Magnolia Creek to be closer to her son. She was sitting at the corner table with Ruby Mae Washington, the two women having bonded over their shared determination to keep Sebastian honest and well-fed. Secret ingredient, Sebastian replied, winking at Dahlia. Same as everything else we make here, a little extra love. The bakery had indeed expanded, but not in the sanitized, corporate way Morrison had envisioned. Instead, they'd gradually taken over the empty spaces on either side, creating a community kitchen where local residents could take cooking classes, a small performance space where musicians played on weekend evenings, and a meeting room where the town council now held its sessions surrounded by the scent of fresh bread and the warmth of genuine community. Tommy Lee's coffee shop had expanded too, his fair trade mission growing to include partnerships with small farmers around the world. The connecting doorway between the two businesses had become a symbol of cooperation rather than competition, of building up rather than tearing down. Dahlia, Jasmine called from the front counter, where she was helping customers while home from college for spring break. Mrs. Peterson wants to know if you can make her granddaughter's wedding cake next month. Tell her yes, Dahlia replied, not looking up from the sourdough she was shaping. And remind her that we'll need to schedule a tasting appointment. This was the rhythm of her days now, community celebrations and daily bread, teaching and learning, growing and preserving all at once. It wasn't the corporate success Sebastian had once pursued or the simple independence Dahlia had thought she wanted. It was something better, a partnership built on shared values and mutual respect, a business that served purposes larger than profit, a love that had transformed them both. Dahlia, Sebastian said softly, moving to stand behind her at the work table. His arms came around her waist, and she leaned back against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him, the certainty of his presence in her life. I have something for you. She turned in his arms, noting the nervous excitement in his expression. "It's not my birthday for another month. It's not that kind of gift." Sebastian reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box that made Dahlia's heart stop beating. "It's the kind of gift that comes with a question." He dropped to one knee right there in the kitchen, surrounded by rising bread and the lingering scent of apple turnovers, with Ruby May and Margaret Cross watching from their corner table and the afternoon light streaming golden through the windows. "Dahlia Brooks," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion shining in his eyes, "you saved my life in ways I'm still discovering. You taught me the difference between surviving and living, between building walls and building dreams. You showed me that real strength comes from vulnerability, that real wealth comes from connection, that real success is measured in the lives we touch with kindness." He opened the box to reveal a ring that took her breath away, not because of its size or expense, but because of its meaning. The center stone was a vintage diamond that caught the light like captured starfire, but it was the band that made her gasp. Delicate apple blossoms etched in gold, a design that honored both their family's agricultural heritage and the new growth they were creating together. "Will you marry me?" Sebastian asked. "Will you let me spend the rest of my life learning your grandmother's recipes and making new ones with you? Will you teach me how to be the man my grandmother always believed I could become?" Dahlia stared down at him through tears that blurred her vision but couldn't hide the love in his eyes, the vulnerability in his expression, the courage it had taken him to risk his heart one more time. "Yes," she whispered, then stronger, "Yes, Sebastian Vale. Yes to all of it." He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, then rose to sweep her into his arms and spin her around the kitchen while Ruby May cheered and Margaret Cross wiped away tears and Jasmine shrieked with excitement from the front counter. When he finally set her down, they were both laughing and crying and holding each other like they'd never let go. The ring caught the afternoon light streaming through th.